So we get started in Ezra chapter 3 this evening. We want to begin by going through the outline of the book. The book of Ezra divides itself into two major sections. The first 6 chapters are dealing with the return that takes place under Zerubbabel. The purpose of this return, as we talked about last week, was for national restoration of Judah. It's bringing the people back into Jerusalem. It's restoring the nation. And then the goal therein is they're going to build the temple as they come into Jerusalem. And we'll talk about that tonight. The second is the return under Ezra, beginning in chapter 7 and going through verse 10. This is the Ezra whose name the book bears. And this is the return that is for spiritual reformation, bringing them back to service to God and where they need to be in their service to God in Ezra 7 through 10. Last week as we began in Ezra chapter 1, Ezra 1 was dealing with preparations for the people to come back to Jerusalem. We had the first 4 verses of chapter 1 record for us the decree of Cyrus, that same decree that we closed 2 Chronicles with. And then we had in verses 5 through 11 them making some preparations. Chapter 2 dealt, with the most part, with a lengthy list of names of people, who they were, what tribe and family they belonged to, coming back to Jerusalem. But as we get ready to get into chapter 3 is going to be laying the foundation of the temple. I want us to back up for just a second to the end of chapter 2. Back up into the end of chapter 2, verse 68. Some of the heads of the fathers' houses, when they came to the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to erect it in its place. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for the work 61,000 gold drachmas, 50,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly garments. So the priest and the Levites, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the Nethinim, dwelled in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. So as chapter 2 came to a close, people were giving for the purpose of what? There in verses 68 and 69. They're giving according to their ability, and what are they giving in order to do? It says they came freely to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to erect it in its place. Now, if you remember backing up into chapter 1 for just a moment, setting back the background of where we are in chapter 3, in chapter 1, Cyrus said in his decree that all the kingdoms of the earth the God of heaven has given to me, and He has commanded me to build Him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah, who is among you of all His peoples. May His God be with him, and let him go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is God, which is in Jerusalem. So in Cyrus's decree, not only were the people to go back, the people were to go back and do what? Build a house for God. That was part of the decree that Cyrus mentioned in his decree. They're supposed to go back and build a house for the Lord. Coming into the end of chapter 2, the people are giving for the purpose of them doing what? Building that house for the Lord. Now let's come into chapter 3 where we have the laying of the foundation. The first 7 verses is where worship is being restored in Jerusalem. Verses 1 through 7. And when the 7th month had come, and the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered together as one man to Jerusalem. Then Jeshua the son of Jozadak and his brethren, the priests, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and his brethren, arose and built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses the man of God. Though fear had come upon them because of the people of those countries, they set the altar on its bases, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening burnt offerings. So as the people come here in verses 1 through 3, and they come into Jerusalem, they are beginning to erect what to the Lord? Or to worship the Lord? They make an altar here in order to worship the Lord. So here they are erecting this altar to to serve God, to offer sacrifices to God. So the people gathered together as one man in Jerusalem, and they arose and built an altar of the Lord God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. So they're coming together to offer sacrifices to God, to offer worship to God, as is prescribed where? In the law of Moses. And so the people are coming together to offer worship to God. Verse 3 says, though fear had come upon them because of the people of those countries. The NIV says, despite their fear of the peoples around them. So as the people come together in verse 3, taking the rendering of the NIV there, despite their fear. As you take that rendering there, what is it telling us in verse 3 before they offer the sacrifice to God? What are the people? They are afraid because of the people of those countries. And they set an altar on its bases, and they offer the burnt offerings on it to the Lord. So though they feared, or despite their fear, they still offered a sacrifice to God. Now think about that for just a second. Here are some people that have been where? Where have they just come back from? Captivity. How long were they in captivity? 70 years. From the time of the first captivity to the time of this first return that's taken place under Rubble. The people come back after having been taken away. The people that were overpowered and taken out of their homeland, forced to live somewhere else for 70 years, they come back now. Now, the people were taken away because they failed to do what? Obey God, and they failed to serve Him properly. Here the people come back into the land, and despite the fact, or though they feared the other people, they still, despite the fear they had for those around them, offered worship to God. They still erected an altar there and offered burnt offerings to the Lord, despite their fear. Now, right, they're trying to overcome their fear. And that's one of the two views that is had concerning this verse. The question is, how does this sacrifice relate to their being terrified? And it could be that perhaps it suggests their courage. One commentator said perhaps it suggests their courage in spite of the fear they offered sacrifices. Or he said that another way is maybe they offered their sacrifices because of fear. And they feared the nations around them, but they realized that they had no need to fear those around them if they what? Worship God and serve Him, and He is on their side. So there's two possibilities there in verse 3, that it's either they offered their sacrifices, could be they offered sacrifices by courage in spite of fear, or they offered sacrifices because of their fear. But either way, there's fear. The people of Judah, the people that have returned to Jerusalem, fear the people of those countries, yet in spite of that, they offer sacrifice to God. Let's pick up at verse 4 now. They also kept the Feast of Tabernacles, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings in the number required by ordinance for each man. Afterwards they offered the regular burnt offering and those for new moons, and for all the appointed feasts of the Lord they were consecrated, and those of everyone who willingly offered a freewill offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, although the foundation of the temple had not been laid. They also gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, to bring cedar logs from Lebanon to the sea, to Joppa, according to the permission which they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. So the people come together and they're offering the sacrifice they need to be offering. They're keeping the feast they need to be keeping. But even though they're doing all this, there's not what? There's no temple. Still there. They've come together, but the foundation of the temple has not yet been laid. So the people are here worshiping God. They're offering burnt offerings. But one of the things they've been brought back to do is to build a temple. Remember, part of what was destroyed in the conquering from Babylon, when they finally laid Jerusalem to ruin, was the temple that Solomon had built. That beautiful temple we read about a few months ago. as we studied in 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles just last trimester. That temple is laid to ruin. It is no more. And there they are where the temple had once been laid. Here they are in this area offering sacrifices to God, and yet there is no temple. So, beginning at verse 8, the foundation of the temple will be laid. So beginning at verse 8, now they will be laying the foundation of the temple, which they were there for the purpose of building the temple and restoring the people back to Jerusalem. So as we pick up in verse 8 now, as the foundation is laid, Ezra 3 and verse 8. Now in the second month of the second year of their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, Jeshua the son of Jezadok, and the rest of their brethren, the priests and the Levites, and all who had come out of the captivity to Jerusalem, began work and appointed the Levites from 20 years old and above to oversee the work of the house of the Lord. Then Jeshua with his sons and brothers, Kadmiel with his sons, and the sons of Judah arose as one to oversee those working on the house of God, the sons of Henadad with their sons and their brethren, the Levites. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests stood in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord according to the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His mercy endures forever toward Israel. Then all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this temple was laid before their eyes. Yet many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout for joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the sound was heard afar off. Now, so back up here into verse 8 and 9. Here they're beginning to come back to this work in the second month of the second year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem. Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of their brethren, the priests and the Levites, they come together, those that came out of captivity, to begin work on the house of the Lord. And as they come together, and they've got those appointed to do the work that is necessary for the house of the Lord. Here are their jobs. The Levites 20 and up, they've put them over to oversee the work. And as they've got everybody over their jobs, everybody has their responsibilities, and the work begins, the foundation is laid. And as this foundation is laid, there are two responses. Let's take the first, mentioned in verse 10. And that is in verse 10, there is a response of what? Well, there's weeping down when we get down to verse 12, but the response for most of the people is a response of what? Great joy. So here a lot of the people, as they've come and the foundation is laid, are very joyful to see this foundation laid for the temple. And now for just a second, put yourself in the shoes of the younger people that have come out of captivity. We'll come down to the older people in verse 12 in a second. But put yourself in the shoes of those that would have been younger. Those who, when they were in captivity, would have never seen the original temple. They never would have seen the temple built by Solomon. So here you come, and you've been in captivity. And you've probably heard the stories from your parents or grandparents about the temple in Jerusalem and about how they worship God and why it is that they're now in this strange land. And now you get to come to Jerusalem, your home country, but you've never been there. And now you get to be part of laying the foundation to the second temple, to this house that is being built for God. And there's great joy in that. There are those that there are some others that would be a little bit older that may have never seen the temple, that there's great joy because here we're finally building back the temple. And what did the temple represent? It's the house of God. And remember in the temple too, when the temple is built, the same thing happened with the tabernacle. What happened with the temple as soon as it is completed and they're offering sacrifices? Right. Here he's showing his acceptance and his presence. You have the glory of God that when Solomon completes that temple, that same glory that had been, that same representation that had been over the tabernacle goes into the temple. It represents God being among His people, as they can see the glory of God there, as they can hear the stories, and there's that temple. But eventually the people leave serving God, and so God is no longer there with them, and the people and that's destroyed, and the temple is brought to ruins. And so now they come back. That temple is not the same, but another temple is being rebuilt on that same area. That foundation is laid for these people. It represents God being among His people again. But then we have a second reaction in verse 12. We have a reaction of those who weep. Why is it they wept? They remembered the first temple. This is a much, much smaller temple. And you could imagine, as we read through and going through Kings and Chronicles, and sometimes you get through there and there's all this detail about the temple and this covering and this made out of gold and this made out of silver. And you read all these details, but understand this, when you finish that reading, you understand, if you can picture it in your mind, that temple was very what? Had to be very beautiful to see. That temple that Solomon had built, that temple with remember, the days of Solomon, the nation was so wealthy that silver was referred to as being as common as what? Stones. And here's this temple that's built up with the gold, and it had to be just beautiful to see. And here are those who've seen that. And now they're building a second temple, and it's not going to be anything like the first. Oh, it represents that God will be among His people. And it's the place for them to come and worship Him, but it'll be nothing like what they saw before. Remember this, as we talk about the time frames. The captivity lasted 70 years, but that's counted from which captivity to which returned? First to first. So the first captivity takes place in about 605 or 606 BC. We have a return taking place in 536 BC. That's this return under Rubble. But Jerusalem comes to ruin and this is when the temple will be destroyed, in 586 BC. That's when the last of the captives are going to be taken away. That's when the temple was destroyed. So though we've had 70 years of captivity from the first captivity to this first return, we've had only how long since the temple's been destroyed? 50. And so there could have been quite a few people there who may have remembered that first temple. That may have been part of some of the later captivities that remember that first temple. So here they are as they see this second one being erected, and they think, they weep. I'm sure there's some joy in them to see that a temple is being rebuilt, but there's weeping because it's nothing. Those that had seen the previous temple, this is going to be nothing like the temple that Solomon built. But the people rejoiced so greatly. There was such loud noise between those who rejoiced and those who wept that you couldn't discern between the two. And it was such a loud noise that the sound was heard afar off. Verse 13 tells us. Now, before we move into chapter 4, something interesting to note. There are some, even though this temple may be nothing like the first, there are some parallel things that take place between the building of both temples. Some recorded in this chapter, some in chapter 2, some will be recorded later on when it's completed, which will be years down the road, and we'll get to that next week in chapters 5 and chapter 6. But there are 5 really comparisons of the two temples. Both temples had materials that were collected beforehand in order to get the work done. Ezra chapter 2, 68 and 69, the people gave in order for them to build the temple. Well, remember, Solomon built the temple, but who made preparatory work for it? David did. David couldn't build the temple himself, but he made some preparatory work in gathering things together, so all Solomon had to do was build it. Here's a second comparison. Yes, they had preparation for both temples taken ahead of time, as recorded for us in Ezra chapter 2. Here's a second comparison. Tyre and Sidon were the ones that provided wood. That's recorded for us in Ezra 3:7. If you look at Ezra 3 and in verse 7, it said they also gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre to bring cedars, logs, and Lebanon to the sea, to Joppa, according to the permission which they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, not only that, but it's the king of Tyre in 1 Kings chapter 5 that Solomon has a conversation with that gives the wood that's going to be built and the cedars to be built for the first temple. Here's a third comparison. The work actually began in the same month. In Ezra chapter 3 and in verse 8, it says, now in the second month of the second year, and the same thing is recorded, and it's the second month of 1 Kings chapter 6 and in verse 1. Here's a fourth. Both brought rejoicing. In Ezra 3:10, as the foundation is laid, the people are joyful that they are building this temple. In 2 Chronicles chapter 5, 13 and 14, the trumpets are sounding and the people rejoice as the first temple is brought to its completion. And in the case of both temples, they offer sacrifices as they celebrated in Ezra 6, 14 through 18. We'll talk about that next week. And then also here in 1 Kings chapter 8, 62 through 66. That's recorded in both of those cases. Just some comparisons between the two. Now, Ezra chapter 4. Ezra chapter 4 is about opposition to building the temple. Unfortunately, this is a true statement no matter the time frame. Whether it's building the temple here, whether it's when we get into the book of Nehemiah later on and they seek to rebuild the walls, whether it's in our day and time today. When people are trying to do what they ought and people are serving God, the people of God will ultimately face opposition. So the people here in Ezra chapter 4 have laid a foundation. In chapter 3 they laid a foundation. Now we come into chapter 4 and we have opposition. Now, as a note as we come into chapter 4, 1 through 5 is covering the time frame of Cyrus. That's the time frame we're under in 1 to 5. That's the same time frame in which the people have returned. It's during the reign of Cyrus. Then we're going to have some opposition that is faced by the people in their endeavors after their return, under Ahasuerus and under Artaxerxes. Those will be recorded for us later in the chapter. But verse 24, when we come back, is the reaction that takes place originally starting under Cyrus. So keep that in mind for just a second. 1 to 5 is the opposition that takes place during the reign of Cyrus. Verse 6 is during the reign of Ahasuerus. 7 to 23 is the opposition during the reign of Artaxerxes I. And then verse 24 is the result of that opposition. But that's actually, verse 24, the result of the original opposition faced in 1 to 5. But these others are going to be some examples of some opposition that is faced throughout their time. Now, verses 1 to 5. Let's begin at verse 1. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the descendants of the captivity were building the temple of the Lord God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses. And they said to them, let us build with you, for we seek your God as you do, and we have sacrificed to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. But Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses of Israel said to them, you may do nothing with us to build a house for our God, but we alone will build to the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. Then the people of the land tried to discourage the people of Judah. They troubled them in building and hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So here in these first 5 verses, there are those that are described as the adversaries or enemies of Judah and Benjamin that come and say, we want to help you in building this temple because we've been serving this God all the way back to the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria. All this time we've been serving this God. Let us help you in building a house for God. But how does Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of the people respond? Nothing in common with us. You may do nothing with us to build a house for God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel. Now, why is it the people would refuse? The people of Israel would say no to these people that have come to them and offered help? Absolutely. These are the people later known as the Samaritans. Question is raised, is the description of adversaries in verse 1, they were already adversaries, or maybe that's a description of what takes place in the time that follows. Remember, Ezra is writing about previous events in the days of Zerubbabel that Ezra is recording back, but Ezra isn't alive till much later. Ezra's return takes place in the 400s, versus this return is taking place in the 500s. So the adversaries are those that are later referred to as Samaritans. And they walk that line between, we'll serve the God of this land, but they're also serving idols. So they are the ones, the Samaritans, throughout their history, and especially at this time, as we're talking about them at this moment in time in history that we're reading about, were a lot like former Israel and Judah. And that is, they don't want to serve God over here, but serve the idols over here, and serve God over here and the idols over here. Difference was, Israel and Judah allowed that in by not destroying the people and intermarrying with them. This case, the Samaritans, this half Jewish people and half the people of the land, resulted from the captivity that took place, but the same thing results. They go between the two. So, do these people, are they probably serving God? To some extent. There's no need for us to seem to question their sincerity in thinking they're serving God, but at the same time, considering their history and what takes place after this, they're also very likely serving idols. And by doing that, the people of Israel, or the people of Judah, the people that have come out of captivity, will ultimately put a stumbling block before themselves to put them right back in the situation that what? Put them into captivity in the first place. And so they don't need to accept this help from these people lest they end up mixing the religions together. Lest they have those that serve God and those that are serving idols, and the two are no longer distinguished. We're back to old Israel and Judah. Those that will serve, they'll come and offer their sacrifices when they need to, but then they'll turn around and pass children through the fire to Molech. They'll come over here and they'll offer their sacrifice to God, but they'll go and worship in the temple of Baal. And we don't want to end up with a situation like that. And so they say no. How do these people respond? These adversaries, as they're referred to in verse 1, respond. Absolutely. It said in verse 4 that they tried to discourage them. They're bringing them down. They're bringing them down. Trying to discourage the people. If somebody doesn't do what you want to do, or somebody won't let you in on what you want to do, you think about with children, if you have a child that's playing something over here, and another child wants to play with them, and they tell them no, that second child, the child that asked to play with the first child, is going to try to find some way to frustrate that other child till they get what they want. Or the other child just gives up on what they want. Well, that's kind of how the people are reacting here. If Israel won't let us, if Judah won't let us get involved, then we're going to discourage them. And if they're not going to let us help build the temple, then guess what? They're not going to build a temple either. And so they seek to discourage them. They troubled them. They hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose. And they did this all the days of Cyrus and until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. By the way, that's why verse 24 was we're going to continue on through some other events that take place and some other opposition they face. Verse 24 mentions the reign of Darius and what takes place and what's put on hold. That's how we know that it fits here with the timeline of what's taking place in 1 to 5, during the reign of Cyrus and the reign of Darius. But let's move on into the next list. Opposition during the reign of Ahasuerus. In the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. That's what we have recorded for us of the reign in the days of Ahasuerus. But they wrote some accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Again, if they can't get them to do what they want them to do, then they'll find some way to frustrate them till they do what they want them to do. But now, come down into verse 7. We have more opposition. We have opposition in the days of Cyrus. We have opposition in the days of Ahasuerus. We have opposition now in the days of Artaxerxes. In the days of Artaxerxes also. In the days of Artaxerxes also, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabal, and the rest of their companions wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the letter was written in Aramaic script and translated into the Aramaic language. Rahum, the commander of Shimshai, the scribe, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes in this fashion. Now, I'll pick up in just a second and read the letter. A couple of things to note. Verse 7 mentions Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabal, and the rest of their companions that wrote to Artaxerxes. And verse 8 mentions Rehum the commander, and Shimshai the scribe wrote a letter against Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes. Now, it seems like there could be here, in verse 7 and 8, two different letters that are written in the days of Artaxerxes, written by two different groups, both, though, with the purpose of frustrating the Jews. This letter by Bishlam, Mithridath, and Tabal, and then a letter by Rehum and Shimshai. But, whether this is two letters or one letter, here is sort of an interesting fact that takes place, beginning here at verse in verse 8, and going on into chapter 6. In the Old Testament, most of the Old Testament is written in what language? Hebrew. We often think of the Scriptures being written in two original languages, the Old Testament in Hebrew, the New Testament in Greek. And that is true for the vast majority. But beginning at Ezra 4 and in verse 8, and going through chapter 6 and in verse 18, as well as a section in chapter 7 and in verse 12, and going on through verse 26, it is written not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic. So this is a section of Scriptures written in Aramaic. So yes, the majority of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. In fact, if you go from verse 7 back through the beginning part of Ezra, what's it written in? Hebrew. But now beginning at verse 8, and going through chapter 6 and in verse 18, as well as that section in chapter 7, are written in Aramaic. Now, the letter here was written in the Aramaic language, and it is sent to Artaxerxes. It is sent to him in this fashion. From Rehum, the commander, Shimshai the scribe, and the rest of their companions, representatives of the Danites and Arphaschalites and Tarpalites, the Deovites and Elamites, and the rest of the nations whom the great and noble Osnapper took captive and settled in the cities of Samaria and the remainder beyond the river, and so forth. So this is the start. This is the introduction to the letter. Verse 11 says, this is the copy of the letter they sent to him. Let it be known to the king. Let it be known, or the letter they sent to him, to King Artaxerxes from your servants, the men of the region beyond the river and so forth. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem and are building the rebellious and evil city and are finishing its walls and repairing the foundations. Let it now be known to the king that if the city is built and the walls completed, they will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. Now, because we received support from the palace, it was not proper for us to see the king's dishonor. Therefore, we have sent and informed the king that search may be made in the book of records of your fathers. And you will find in the book of the records and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces. And they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if the city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. Now, think about this for just a second. You've probably heard this before. In order for somebody to tell a story or a lie and it be effective, it typically has a little bit of what? Truth to it. Now I want you to think about the history of Judah for a second. Had there been times that other nations were over Judah and had forced Judah to pay taxes or tribute, and they rebelled against them? Well, we saw that in 2 Kings and Chronicles. Is it true that as they refused to pay tribute, eventually it led to the people being angered and Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon come up in opposition and destroy? That's partially true. They're ultimately destroyed for what they do wrong in not serving God, and God punishes them. But as far as some of the people see, they see, hey, they didn't pay tribute. Search back in your records and find. Well, if you go back in your records, do you think they'll find the fact that there were other nations that Judah refused to pay tribute to that originally they were? Yes. But is it true that these people in Judah and Jerusalem, that these people serve a great threat to Artaxerxes and his power? Is it true that these people are rebuilding a city so they can rebel again against the king? Is it true that if they rebuild this city that they will take away his dominion beyond the river? I mean, what kind of shape is the nation in? What kind of shape is the people that have returned in? Well, they're in no shape to take on the world empire. But if you tell King Artaxerxes, hey, if this takes place, you know what's not going to happen? You're no longer going to have dominion beyond the river. Guess what? He's going to listen. It's going to catch his eye to talk about his dominion being taken away. So the king sent an answer to Rehoboam the commander, to Shimei the scribe, to the rest of their companions who dwell in Samaria, and to the remainder beyond the river. Beginning now at verse 17. Peace and so forth. The letter which you sent has been clearly read before me. And I gave the command, and a search has been made, and it was found that the city in former times has revolted against king, and rebellion and sedition has been fostered in it. Again, that had happened. They would find it in the records. There have also been mighty kings over Jerusalem who have ruled over all the region beyond the river, and tax, tribute, and custom were paid to them. Is that true? We think about during the days of David and Solomon and going back into the history. Kings over Jerusalem who had ruled in all the region beyond the river. Go back to the days over there where they're ruling on that side of the land. Maybe he's reading about the days of David and Solomon and the power that was then. Now, they were never to the standing of a kingdom like the Medes and the Persians or Babylon or anything like that, but there were great and mighty nation during the days of David and Solomon. So now, verse 21, now give the command to make these men cease, that the city may not be built until the command is given by me. Take heed now that you do not fail to do this. Why should damage increase to the hurt of the kings? Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehoboam, Shimei the scribe, and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem against the cities, and the force of arms made them cease. So they send a letter to Artaxerxes. They say, listen, these people are going to be in rebellion against you. They've done it before. What makes you think they're not going to do it again? After they finish building the city, you need to put a stop to it. Artaxerxes says, I found that it's true. They've done it before. So y'all go up and put a stop to it. Go up there and stop them from continuing to rebuild. And so Rehoboam, Shimei the scribe, and their companions went up to haste in Jerusalem, and they made them stop. It had to be quite the letter for Rehoboam, Shimei, and their companions to receive. Exactly what they wanted to happen is now taking place. They're told to go put a stop to the work at Jerusalem. Now, verse 24. Verse 24 is the result of the opposition. Thus the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, ceased, and it was discontinued in the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. All this opposition the people have faced, dating back to the days of Cyrus. They faced opposition in the days of Ahasuerus. They faced opposition in the days of Artaxerxes. the people ceased building the temple. In fact, next week, when we come into chapter 5, we're going to have two prophets mentioned to us in chapter 5 and in verse 1. Two prophets who also wrote a book that bears their names, Haggai and Zachariah, that have to be sent. And if you go read Haggai and Zachariah, and next week we'll just mention what is mentioned here mostly in Ezra about them, because a study of those books will take place later on when we get to those in more detail. But the work of Haggai and Zachariah is going to be to remind the people that, listen, you need to get up and you need to build the temple. Because after all this opposition that they faced, the people ceased. They ceased building the temple. They did not get back to it until the prophets come and remind them, hey, you need to get back up and get to work. Now, our time is almost up this evening, but let's talk about some practical application. We've gone through that rather quickly, these two chapters, but there's a lot of practical application that we can make to our lives from these chapters. What are some practical lessons we see?
Go back to chapter 4, verse 4, where they discourage the people. When you're trying to do the work of the Lord, there's people out there that's going to be against it no matter what. And those people will turn and twist what you say. This might be the way.
Absolutely. You're going to face opposition. Those people will discourage you. You're right. It's going to happen. You're going to face it. And it doesn't matter what time frame it is. It doesn't matter if it's all the way back in the days of Rubble. It doesn't matter if it's in the first century. It doesn't matter if it's now. If you strive to do what is right, there's going to be, always has been, always will be, opposition. Which really means we need to learn how to handle that opposition. There was a lot better way the people of Judah could have handled that opposition than how they end up handling it in this text, where they just originally cease. Remember, long before all these letters are sent from Artaxerxes and all that, they've ceased doing the work all the way back when they faced that original discouragement back in verses 4 and verse 5. And the people are stopping to do the work that is necessary. They never faced the opposition. This is long before any king sent down some letter and said, hey, stop building. What else do we see? Absolutely. God will help us through the opposition. Absolutely. No matter how good times are, bad times are, God is always there for us. Here's something else we need to realize. We cannot be giving in to our enemies. I want you to think about how quickly things turned in the days of Rubble from the people shouting with such joy that it was heard afar off to the foundation laying there for many years until Haggai and Zachariah come along and tell the people, you need to finish the work. Because they gave in. Well, there may be times today that we face opposition, those that seek to discourage us, and that will come. If it hasn't happened before, it will. And while it may not be quite to the level of what they may have faced, when we face opposition, there comes a time we've got to realize we cannot give in to the demands of those who oppose what we're doing when what we're doing is right. And I also realize there should be some rejoicing when it comes to serving God. Here are the people that are, first of all, they're excited to serve God. They begin to offer sacrifices to God and to keep all the feasts to God. And they're doing all that before they've ever even built the temple. And then here they are beginning to build the temple, the house of the Lord, where they're going to be worshiping Him. And the reaction of the people is one of such great joy that it was heard afar off. Now, we're not going to be crying out for such joy as the people were when the foundation was laid. But when we come to serve God, do we have such great joy as the people did at the laying of the foundation? Because they knew here the laying of the foundation for the house of the Lord. Yet here we come to worship God each and every first day of the week and each and every Wednesday. Do we have such great joy as the people did in the days of the Rubble? Absolutely. Even if we don't have a building. Such joy to be able to serve and worship God. Next week we'll be in chapter 5 and chapter 6, and we'll talk about the building of the temple.